Hello, family, and welcome to Amazing Parents Network. I am the host of this show. My name is Ali Lankarani, Dr. L, the Parent Whisperer. I'm a clinical neuroscientist, and I am very happy that you have taken the time to be here with us tonight. We have dozens of experts that are going to be presenting in the upcoming months. These are called the Family Education Series. Please invite your friends and family to come and benefit from the resources and the expertise that is going to be presented here. We're glad to have you here. We're glad to have our experts. Enjoy tonight's presenter. Thank you. Hello, family and friends, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you being here for the fundamentals of healthy eating. The goal of this series is for me to give you an overview of what we want to do for the children over the coming weeks. We have four different groups of kids. Actually, it starts before they're even born. We actually start with planning parenthood and pregnancy, conception, and the birth, and those early years of parenting. And then we are going to move on to the toddlers, the young kids, and eventually teens and tweens as they establish healthy habits and learn to leave the nest with good habits, life skills. So the purpose of this is more for conversational purposes for me and you guys as parents, and kind of talking about the importance of you knowing that there's a lot of misconceptions out there when it comes to nutrition. There are fad diets, and even our typical medical training does not often address the issues of nutrition. We have a lot of research. The academians, I guess, and the researchers have things that are very solid and concrete, but by the time that it makes it to the general population, in private practices, in advice on media, it's actually taken in bits and pieces, and it's very inaccurate and kind of varies from time to time. And as you know, the human body is so elegant that it's not just one principle that really applies. So, a couple of things that I do want to mention to you about what is to happen in the coming months is that our goal is to make sure that number one, the kids have this extra awareness about the importance of food, where it comes from, its relationship to its body, and ultimately how it affects them and how they show up in the world. Having that understanding is very important because then they become motivated themselves to learn more. And that's what we want. We want these curious learners to actually learn and explore and develop their own healthy eating habits as it agrees with their bodies, knowing some of the foundational pieces about nutrition. So whether they are at a party, whether they're at a restaurant, whether they are with their friends and outing, they can go ahead and make those decisions. Now, having said that, there's also some developmental milestones. So I want to make sure that for those of you who have children that are younger than the age of 6, that you do not make this black and white because they're in the process of exploring, and you need to make sure that you set them up for success. So if so there's parts of their frontal brain that have not developed enough for them to be able to inhibit their impulses. So telling them that you should have chose differently or you should choose this and not that can become a source of internal conflict. And you don't want them to become anxious or sad that they can't make the decision that you want them to make. And then they fear like they're disappointing you. So this is really, really important for you guys to remove that emotional component from this, set them up for success. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. But let's start from the very beginning. The very important thing that you need to first understand is that when it comes to choosing to have a child, your body as a future parent needs to be ready. So we're going to talk about it in our first session about that, the importance of making sure that your body is ready to actually have a child and grow a child and birth a child. So that process and your reproductive systems that will continue to serve you long after your child has been born is essential for your health and ultimately role modeling the behavior for your kids and ultimately grandkids as well. with that being said, you need to understand that many of the things that we're going to ask for the kids, it would be that much more essential if that becomes part of your lifestyle. So they learn through practice and through what they are exposed to on a day-to-day basis. I can't tell you how many times I found parents that had come to me in private practice with children that had developmental issues, and their brain was not up to the task simply because there was malnourishment that had happened because the parents inadvertently were subjecting their kids to this because of their own lifestyle habits and cultural and other things that had impacted how they eat and how they consume nutrition. So you need to have an understanding of the body, you need to have an understanding of the nutrients that go in the body. And ultimately, when you can show the kids that you can do it, and it's a lot harder for you than it is for them because they don't have the bad habits and the addictions and all of those sensitivities and everything else that comes with age and experience, then they actually can go ahead and learn more. And going back to those young, before 6 year old children, when you say, hey, would you like to have an orange or an apple? It's kind of like setting them up for success if you want them, if the goal is for them to have a piece of fruit, right? Instead of saying, do you want potato chips that's on the table versus do you want an apple, or chocolate, dark chocolate versus cake, so it's a lot of this is exposure. A lot of it is also, especially for those younger taste buds, is what they were exposed to first. So even in our medical community, many times the advice is given inadvertently ends up exposing the children and things that later on becomes impossible to retrace back from because it creates this neurologic loop of reward that is unequal to the benefit. So the end result is that the kids get stuck early on into lifestyle habits that they can't escape out of, or basically, in order to escape out of it, it's almost like a food addiction where they have to like work with a professional to get rid of those things. So just wanted to mention those things. So early on, it's important about your health to make sure that your body's needs, reproductive needs, are addressed. Later on, it's the whole process of pregnancy and birthing is a natural process. It is not a medical procedure. So you need to look at it as such, that it is something that your body is designed and evolved to do. So that process is important. The other part is that we have evolutionarily and anthropological factors that go into who we are today. And those things cannot be ignored when it comes to addressing your health, right? So we're going to talk about some of those details because if you are from the tropics or if you are from the Nordic regions, your body over time genetically has evolved to process certain foods better than others. Also, there are cultural differences. So those cultural differences means that your body is exposed to different things. So when your body is exposed to different things, what ends up happening is you have certain um, kind of gravity and you know attachment to certain types of food and the way it's done, not because of the food itself, but because these cultural and emotional factors that are involved with it. Nowadays, marketers and fast food companies are very aware of that, and they try to create a culture and a community and experience around their food, so that even if the kids know that that food is not good for them, and for them to give that food up, that means that they're giving up on the community and that experience, and that's a lot harder to say no to. So I want you to be aware of this. Lastly, the anthropological factors. The fact that we have gone from a group of gatherers to basically the agriculture and farm and ranch style, where we have domesticated animals and over the process of eons, not naturalized, what do you call this? Self-selected or selective breeding of animals and the produce and the plants that we consume. So many of the stuff that we have evolved artificially over these aeons are not what they originally were in the wild. And then last, partly with the industrialization, the depletion of the soil, the nutritional content, the genetic modification, and some of those things that comes effect. So that being said, and I know that's a lot of information already, I want you guys to wrap your mind around these foundational pieces, acknowledging our past, also acknowledging your upbringing in your lifetime, that you have been exposed, you were brought up in a time that scientifically, culturally, socially, research-wise, and scientifically was very different than where we are today. And now we're planning to have children, or if your children are teenagers, even longer, right? So you have a few decades on you, and those decades, you have built experiences, you have built preferences, you have built sensitivities and addictions and all of these things to certain food groups. And you can't deny that. And understanding that if today you want to start moving in the right direction, it requires you to make certain changes, and changing habits is a very difficult thing to do. So we need to be able to replace habits with new habits. You can't just quit something without having something to replace for it. The typical thing, especially when you look at my experience with the addiction centers, is that when they're trying to wean you off of an addictive drug like heroin or cocaine or whatever it happens to be, they have to substitute a less addictive substance in its place, and then ultimately a less addictive substance in the place of the one that is not as addictive as the initial drugs, basically. So you kind of step down until a point where you can leave that scenario and your body does not crave that and you don't feel like you're missing something. So it's a gradual process. This is a lifelong skill. This is a life habit. So you need to be kind to yourself and kind to your body, accept yourself as who you are, and keep focusing on who you want to become, so that that process will create the manifestation of you becoming the person you want to be, focusing on how that feels, focus on how you show up. And that's ultimately the message we want to give to our kids, that we want to fulfill how we envision ourselves performing in the world. And in order to do that, there are certain things that we need to do on a day-to-day basis. With my children, many times I would say, this was my core message in their early years. I said, if you can monitor what goes into your mouth and ultimately what comes out of your mouth, you're better than 99% of the human beings on this planet as far as being in control of what happens in your future, in your destiny. Not better as in, you're a better person, but as in you're in more control of your life, basically. So if you can control this and what goes in and out of it, then you actually are in a situation where you have more control over your life and destiny than most of the humans on this planet. So that is the starting point, basically. And ironically, evolutionarily, that's not far from the truth. From millions of years ago, we actually started with focusing on the resources that are going into us and ultimately how we communicated with the world outside of us. So all of that revolved around our digestive system and our nervous system, which to this day, millions of years later, billions of years later, actually, are very intertwined, basically. So if you don't have a healthy and properly functioning gut, you won't have a properly developing brain and properly optimally functioning brain neither. And that affects your performance everywhere else, motor wise, emotionally, cognitively, and everything else that you can list. Immune system, the list kind of goes on. So without getting into too much details there, let's start with the core principles here. Number one is that we are omnivores. We have canines, we have molars. That means we are designed to have every kind of food out there. So eliminating food groups entirely was never part of our destiny. We have a gallbladder for digesting fat. So eliminating fat was a non-starter, regardless of how much research there is out there. We're supposed to consume fat. We're supposed to consume carbohydrates. We're supposed to consume proteins when it comes to macronutrients. So we are omnivores, number one. Number two is that when it comes to nutrition, it is far more important for us to focus on how and when we eat as opposed to what we eat. Most people, when we talk about diet, they think about what they're eating, but they need to start thinking about how and when we eat. You need to understand this process, that digestion and absorption of fats and carbohydrates are completely different processes. and they are very different, and it really is taxing on your body. And for most of our anthropological and evolutionary history, these things have been kept separate. But during the last millennia or so, and even more so after the industrialization of the world, what we have seen is that we, thanks to our great brains, we have come up with ways to actually have both of these available to us year round, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the problem is our bodies cannot cope with it. And the end result is the epidemics of diabetes, heart disease, and all these other things that you see. The other thing is that we no longer live 20, 30 years. We live triple that amount. So that means that the small damages that used to happen that would not matter in the old lifestyles now become a much bigger and consequential thing when we're living 3 times as long. So those things are not selected out of us through selective process of evolution. So what ends up happening is we keep passing this down from generation to generation. And in fact, what tends to happen is if not the perpetuation, but actually the exponentiation, the growth of these traits in the next generation. So the bad news is that if you end up having an unhealthy lifestyle, some of the epigenetic factors that you expose yourself and your kids to will manifest in their life. So they're more prone to having these issues as well. And but the good news is that if you actually course correct, your kids will be beneficiaries of it as well. So that's the good news. So let's start taking action today. It's never too late to start. So how we eat needs to keep in mind that our carbohydrates and our fats need to be consumed at separate times and not together. This is where most of the problem is. We are always supposed to consume proteins. That is a given because that's how your body builds itself. So protein with every meal all the time needs to be an incoming thing. And if you eat whole foods, less processed foods, then you're in the clear. You don't need to worry about adequate protein intake. You're taking in enough protein that your body can absorb, provided that you have a healthy gut. But if you do the right things, your gut will become healthy as well. So protein with every meal, separate the carbohydrates and fats and not at the same meal, basically. So if you're having a carbohydrate meal, it's carbohydrates and protein. If you're having a fat meal, it's fat and protein, but not fats and carbohydrates. The trouble is that when we are not in control of our lifestyle, our eating habits, and mindful of preparing and planning our days, what ends up happening is by the time our blood sugar drops, we are craving for survival. And that usually means combining things that give us rapid energy and ensures our long-term survival, which is fats, are put together. So we end up with a lot of things that are super unhealthy for us. So everything from fast food and baked goods to everything else that is super addictive to us is the result of us not being able to manage our blood sugar and keep it at a steady level. So we want to make sure that the planning and the preparation is addressed. And that is goes back to the when we eat. We need to make sure that we are either eating in small and short intervals if we are consuming sugars, and in long intervals if we are consuming primarily fats, because fats take time to burn. So you need to space out your meals. Sugars are digested, metabolized really fast. So you need to have smaller and shorter meals. And hence why there are certain people that are fasting and why there are certain people that say, oh, you need to eat frequently and often and snack in the middle and, don't go hungry and so on and so forth because of that. You've also heard people say breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Well, that's not necessarily true if you're running your body on your primary source of fuel being fat, because you need to burn that. And if you actually break your fast breakfast, then you are back to not burning fats and starting to utilize sugars for fuel. So breakfast would not be a good source if you're trying to run on fats. So hence the conflicting information. Also, bear in mind that most of the research out there is designed without this concept in mind, meaning that when they say red meat is inflammatory, or when they say that a vegetarian diet might lack these things, or whatever it happens to be, they're failing to take into consideration the fact that for most of these situations, people in the research are not taking into effect or taking into consideration that their research involves mixing the fats and the carbohydrates together. And yes, if you mix them together, whether it's the protein, whether it's the carbohydrates, whether it's the fats, it makes a toxic concoction that ends up taxing your body. It causes you to age. It makes you fatigued and tired and all kinds of other stuff. And at the end result is you do not get adequate uptake of your nutrients, basically, and adequate performance. So now you understand the when part as far as whether based on what you're consuming, the how part, keeping the fats and stuff separate, and now the actual what part is important too. This is constantly revised, and you need to always kind of stay ahead of the curve on this. Number one, you wanted to make sure that it's primarily is plant-based. Number two, you want to make sure it's whole foods. Number three, you want to make sure that these are not genetically modified, as organic as possible, to ensure optimal nutrient development. Just because you ate something to fill your gut doesn't mean that it had all the nutrients that you need. So by ensuring that it is non-GMO, that it is wild or pasture raised or what do you call it? Organic, those kind of things, those are grass fed. These kind of things are telling you that the quality of the food is higher, the nutritional content is higher, and there's less risk with consuming that food and suffering consequences, allergic reactions, so on and so forth. So that being said, now the last part of this is that if you understand these concepts, the then you need to understand how to prepare a meal and how to plan for it. And of course, this doesn't start at home. This actually starts when you're shopping. So this is what I mean by setting up your family for success. Because if those foods do not exist in your home, then nobody's ever going to have cravings for them because it's just simply off the menu. It's not available. By going to a restaurant that you know carries healthier foods, you will be exposed to better ingredients, better food by shopping at a grocery store that has higher food qualities. You're exposed to more variety of healthy stuff. You have more diversity and you will get rid of this misconception that healthy foods don't taste good. So when you expose yourself to these things, you start learning that, hey, you know what? Food preparation matters. The quality of the food matters. The where I get the food matters. The people that I eat the food matters. And those other things will create that experience that ultimately comes with the food. And pretty soon you're going to realize that it's not so much the quantity of the food you consume that matters, rather it's the quality of the food and the experience that you gain from having that food. So a couple of other things to set up in your family that I want to mention quickly. Make sure that you avoid eating in front of a screen. That's a bad habit, that a screen equals you putting something in your mouth. So always eat at the table, hopefully with other people. Eat out of a 10-inch plate, never straight out of a bag or a container. So even if you have a container, you can go ahead and take some and put it in there. So you are mindful of the portion that you're pouring into your table, into your plate. A 10-inch plate is the size of an adequate meal. And then ultimately, the last part of this is the distribution of this. And we're going to talk about that, especially with the kids in a more of an experiential learning process. So it's great for them to go ahead and understand this at their level on how to, first of all, go ahead and artistically and imaginatively create a meal for themselves. And later on, how to actually go ahead and combine these and prepare a meal for themselves. And lastly, for those older kids, for them to start developing habits and setting themselves up for success by creating a list of things that they like, creating meal plans so that by the time they're leaving and going to college, they are prepared to always have healthy food around them and not be subject to pizzas and burgers and hot dogs and whatever the community is eating and all the other stuff that comes in because they already have a healthy habit and they don't have to go ahead and create that habit from scratch with poor resources, guidance, and lack of time, right? So before we get there, though, we want to make sure we start at home with role modeling this behavior. So the very first thing that I do want to invite you guys to do, and the link is in the description, is to make sure that you join our Food and Fitness 101, where we actually have ourselves as well as many other experts share insight on different things that are good, provided support, additional content that you can learn from. And you can actually adopt some of these things. Being exposed to support, being exposed to new knowledge is important. And having something like this in the food and fitness group is great for you to not only ask questions, but also get new content and up to date stuff as it comes out. And also, you will get to see other parents and soon to be parents and even youth that are struggling with things, trying to figure out how to overcome certain challenges, how to address certain questions that the kids often ask that you might not have answers to. With that being said, um, we can go ahead and move on basically and go from there. Team, can you pause this for a second? So be sure to join us on the Food and Fitness 101 group. And in the coming week, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on preparing our reproductive cycle for the proper fertilization and the whole process that actually brings about the conception and ultimately being ready to host a child. So we're going to focus on that. This is not something just for moms. This is equally important for dads. There is a statistic that actually is showing that the fertility rate generally for both men and women is declining, at least in North America, if not globally. And by 2045, it could be as low or nearing zero. So this is an alarm, and it might not be affecting you directly, but do realize that these habits can ultimately affect your children and their ability to have kids. So please go ahead and be proactive parents and get started on this. Until next time, cheers.